Welcome to this session, everybody. It's a pleasure to be talking today to Victor Mallett and discussing his book, River of Life, River of Death, the Ganga and India's Future. One of those prominent paradoxes about India is the fact that we have deep, deep reverence for our rivers. We worship them, we bathe in them, even the sight of them is supposed to take away all our sins. And yet that extraordinary reverence is combined with everyday indifference, apathy, and even cruelty. We are really cruel to our rivers. And this central paradox, which puzzles not only Indians, but I think which also fascinates people who visit from outside, as Victor Mallett has done, is, I think, at the core of this book. Victor Mallett is an award-winning journalist. And in his 30 years of professional life, he's traveled around the world reporting from Africa, East Asia, and many, many years in India. And he's currently the Asia news editor at the Financial Times. His first book, The Trouble with Tigers, was not about wildlife conservation, as you might think, but in fact was about the rise of the Southeast Asian economies and the financial crisis in 1997, 1978. And I had a quick look at this book, and what impressed me about it was the depth of the research that's also distinguished along with the very ease with which very, very detailed and complex facts, events, processes are communicated. So very complex issues and ideas also come together in Victor's latest book, River of Life, River of Death, which came out just a couple of months ago and has received almost universal acclaim, which I think is actually something of which tells us about the importance of this book. Because as someone who studies rivers and who writes about them, I have to pretty much read everything on the subject. So when I picked up this book, it was with a sort of ho-hum air, another book about the Ganga, what is this going to tell us? But it was only a few pages into the book that I realized that this is really, really good, because this book is important, it's urgent, it's compelling, and most of all, it has a whole lot of new facts about the river, new analyses about what's going on around the river that we had not known or thought about earlier. So I think this is a tremendously valuable book, and I really urge everyone to read it, but this makes it a double pleasure to be talking to Victor Mallett. Victor's going to tell us a little bit about the book in the beginning. We're going to then talk a little bit after that, and then we will throw the floor open to questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amita, for your incredibly generous introduction. I have to say it's great to be back at Jaipur. I came here many times as a spectator, as a member of the audience, and it's fantastic to be here as an author, because it is indeed the world's greatest literature festival. I'm going to start with a very simple quotation from Eric Newby, author of a book that you may have heard of called Slowly Down the Ganges, which came out in 1966. It's a very simple quotation, and he just said, "I love rivers." And I, of course, am not comparing myself to the great Eric Newby, but I think I and all of us actually love rivers. We all instinctively know that rivers are fundamental to life and to civilization, and almost all the great cities of the world are built at river mouths, river confluences, on river banks. I mean, you only have to think of Delhi, of London, Paris, Cologne, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, where I live, at the mouth of the Pearl River. And we do have plenty of other concerns right now: North Korea, Donald Trump, Brexit, climate change, plastic in the oceans. But the fate of our rivers really should be right up there at the top of the agenda. In fact, a lot of the plastic in the oceans comes down these very rivers, including the Ganges. And the fate of our rivers, especially Himalayan rivers, is really closely bound up with the whole issue of climate change. So, I think of all the environmental, political, social, economic issues that face us today, fresh water and the fate of the rivers of our great rivers really are among the most important. Of course, it's not just the Ganges or the Nile. It's also in India, you know, there's a dispute between two states over the waters of the Kaveri River, which has been going on for a very long time. I was interviewed just now by a journalist from Kerala who was telling me that there are 44 rivers in Kerala and many of them are drying up. So this is a general problem, and the Ganges is obviously afflicted along with the others. So this book is not it's not only a lament for the Ganges. It's also a celebration of the Ganges because it is arguably the world's most famous river, and I think the most important. If you think of its place in culture and history, from the great epics of Indian literature like the Mahabharata, all the way down to Hollywood movies. So I do celebrate that, and I celebrate also the rich wildlife that can be found in and around the Ganges and its tributaries, whether we're talking about tigers or freshwater dolphins, which you can see a long way up the river as far as Allahabad and up some of the tributaries as well of the Ganga. Yes, it's a celebration, but it is also a plea for help, as you mentioned, Amita. You know, a call to save the river before it's too late and to stop the Ganges from suffering the same fate that afflicted rivers elsewhere in the world, including in China, including in Europe, and including the Thames, for example, or the Chicago River in the US. Countless rivers in Asia, Europe, and the Americas have been afflicted by the kind of pollution problems and over-extraction of water that I write about. All rivers are important, but I argue that the Ganges, which is known as the Ganga in Indian languages, is the most important. And it's partly because it's holy to 1 billion or so Hindus in India and around the world. And she is known as a goddess. Ganga is a goddess who purifies, who delivers you to moksha. And the waters of the Ganges are those in which, as a Hindu, you want your ashes to be scattered, preferably in the ancient city of Varanasi. And I mean, actually, Indians, almost by definition, are river people. You know, as I was sort of researching the book, I discovered that the word Indian really comes from a Sanskrit word meaning a big river, which is the Sindhu. The Indus, and that was transferred across to the totality of India. So we're all river people, and those of you who are Indian in the audience will know that Hindus keep bottles of or jars of Ganga Jal, Ganga water, in the home for religious ceremonies, and you can even buy it on eBay today. But the Ganges is also important for less spiritual reasons, and those are simply that hundreds of millions of people live along the river or in the great floodplain of the Ganges in North India. They're nourished by its waters, by the silt it brings down from the Himalayas. And that's really why India has always been one of the most populous places on earth and one of the richest. And of course that wealth that was created by the river and the agriculture that grew up around it is why the Mughals came from Central Asia. It's why the British landed in Calcutta on the banks of the Hooghly, which is part of the Ganges river system in the 17th century, and why they eventually made Calcutta the capital of British India. And India, you know, at one time, if you look back a couple of thousand years, accounted for about 1/3 of global GDP, a larger share even than China at that time, if the calculations are to be believed. And a lot of that was from the wealth and activity generated by the river. Now the Ganges and its sort of numinous presence it can be found all over the world, and I obviously give lots of examples in the book, but I just want to refer to one in England where there's a little village called Stoke Row near Reading in the Chilterns, where there's a little well called the Maharaja's Well. And down this well, I think on at least 2 occasions, Ganges water has been poured to purify the well or to mark the well's importance and holiness. And that's because the Maharaja of Varanasi decided, or had been told by a British bureaucrat, a British official in what was then the United Provinces, that there was a drought in this little village, and that a mother had beaten her child for using the last of the water. So the Maharaja, who had previously benefited from a well that was built in his district, decided that it was time to repay the compliment and help this village. And the well is still there today, and you can still see it. and there was a cherry orchard built alongside it to help finance the maintenance of the wells. And and I'm sure all of us, we have friends from places as far apart as Mauritius and Guyana in South America, in my case, whose families ended up in those places because their ancestors were transported down the river as indentured labourers in the past, as part of the British Empire. There are many of these connections. Indeed, many of the soldiers who fought in Britain's various wars, again, came down the Ganga from Bihar and further up. So about a tenth of the world's population today depends more or less directly on this river, on the Ganga. And one of the holy men, one of the gurus I quote in the book says, the lives of 500 million people is not a small thing. And this is a river on which great civilizations have risen and fallen. Ralph Fitch, in the time of Shakespeare, traveled down the river and just marveled at what was then considered the world's greatest city, Pataliputra, which is now gone, largely made of wood, and is now being replaced by the somewhat less prepossessing Patna, which is the capital of Bihar. But it's surprising how few people, even among Indians, know or remember this extraordinary history of prosperity and glory that existed in ancient times. The Buddha also found, this is not just a Hindu thing, the Buddha found enlightenment in the Ganges Valley. He taught on the river's banks. International trade was conducted from ports that have now disappeared in the Ganges Delta, like Saptagram and Tamralipti. And so this has always been an important river, and it is now very much under threat. And I won't go into too much detail of the pollution issues, which you can find in the book, but of course I'm happy to answer questions. But essentially it's sewage, it's toxic waste, it's fertilizer runoff, pesticides, and also the amount of water that is extracted from the river for agriculture, which leaves the river often without much flow. Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, is a devout Hindu, and he promised to save the river. In fact, he made it a centerpiece of his election campaign when he stood as an MP in Varanasi on the banks of the river in 2014. He said, "I've been called by God," he said, "to save the river. I've been called by Ma Ganga, the mother goddess, to save the river." And he also, later that year in August, his first Independence Day speech from the walls of the Red Fort, not many people remember this, but he didn't talk about religious divisions. He said, "I'm going to talk to you, the people of India, about toilets and the need for sanitation and the need for women's rights." And I remember thinking at the time, this was remarkable and important. Whatever one thinks of Modi's political views, at that time he certainly was saying something that every Indian wanted to hear. Now it's true, and again we can go into this in more detail if you like, but it's true that not much has been achieved yet of his plan to save the river. And there are sort of details of the money that has or hasn't been spent, or has or hasn't been wasted. But I mean, so there is a gloomy side to this book, which is the pollution of the river. Pollution stories are always depressing, but I've tried to be a little bit. I've tried to inject a note of optimism as well in the book, and there is a reason for that, which is that this is not a dead river. It can be saved. As other rivers were saved before. When I was a child living in London, my mother used to say, "Don't fall in the Thames, because you'll have to go to hospital and have your stomach pumped." And it was a dead river. The Thames is now a clean river. My office, my headquarters, I work for the Financial Times, is on the banks of the river, and you can see cormorants fishing under the bridge. And this is just something that didn't exist 50 years ago. The Rhine was also a highly polluted river. In fact, Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote a comic poem about the stenches of the Rhine back in 1828. He said, "The river Rhine, it is well known, doth wash your city of Cologne. But tell me, nymphs, what power divine shall henceforth wash the river Rhine?" And he basically witnessed the horror of the smell of the Rhine. And when Modi met Obama at the White House for the first time in 2014, they talked about environmental issues. They talked about rivers, in fact. And Obama said, well, you know, I'm from Chicago. The Chicago River used to be absolutely disgusting. It was extremely filthy, but now it's being cleaned up. Now there are fish in the river, and you can catch the fish and you can eat them. And Modi said to Obama, that's what I want for the Ganga. So we can talk about whether or not that has been achieved, but that is certainly what he said he wanted. So one reason for optimism, other people have cleaned up their rivers, other countries have cleaned up their rivers, and India can do it too. Also, there's a section of the book, chapter in the book, where I talk about how actually it is, you know, Indians themselves and the states of India, including Uttar Pradesh and West Bengal, which are often seen as the most corrupt and ineffective states in India, when they have religious festivals on the Ganga, they actually pull together and create these extraordinarily well-functioning cities with sanitation, with law and order, with health centers, with running water and electricity and so on. And this happens every time there's a Kumbh Mela. There was a massive one in 2013 at Allahabad at the confluence of the Yamuna and the Ganga. And you know, everybody says, you build this city in 2 months on the sandbanks of the river Ganges, and it all works really well. And 70 million people, the largest gathering of humans on earth, come through this city in the space of a few weeks. Why can't you do that for Allahabad in normal times, or other cities in normal times? And that is a question that is very hard to answer, but it is something that that people worry about a lot. I'll come to an end fairly shortly, but I think one important question that I tried to answer is, why is it that a river that is worshipped is also abused and sullied and damaged by the same people who worship it? And the conclusion I came to from talking to lots of people or listening to lots of people is that there is a separation in the minds of many Hindus between the spiritual purity of the river and the physical properties of the river. So I've seen people chucking garbage into the river, and I say to them, well, why are you dirtying the river? And they'll say, well, that's just physical pollution. The river is pure. She cannot be sullied by anything that I do. And you know, and you would be amazed by the number of people who say this and who use this as a reason for not worrying about the physical pollution. But the answer to this, and this is not just environmentalists, but you'll also get you know, sensible Hindu holy men who will tell you this, is that it is wrong to separate the physical from the spiritual. And the reason is that that Indians worship rivers, and the Ganga in particular, the reason that ancient Britons worshipped rivers was, of course, because of their life-giving properties. They were divine because they gave life. They give you water, they give you fertility to your fields, that is why we love rivers, it's why we worship rivers, it's why they have this spiritual significance for all peoples historically and for Indians today. So if you kill the physical river, if you kill this life-giving force, you actually kill the goddess, you kill the divine nature of the river. And I think that is the best way to explain the problem, and to tell people, actually, you do have to link the physical and the spiritual. The Ganges is still a living river, although some of its tributaries are clearly not. If you've ever been to Delhi, just below Delhi, so when the Yamuna River, which is a big tributary of the Ganges, comes into Delhi, it's quite clean, the water, it's quite pleasant. And after it leaves Delhi, it's essentially raw sewage and industrial waste. And that's what goes on to Mathura and on to Agra and the Taj Mahal. And of course, this is deeply depressing. So what we don't want is for that kind of filth to kill life as it's killed life in the Yamuna, in the Ganga itself. So as I say in the book, you know, Indians are killing the Ganges, and the Ganges in turn is killing Indians. And I say killing Indians because this is actually what is happening. Because by putting untreated sewage in the river, you kill people downstream. Children downstream are dying of totally unnecessary diseases of the gut, you know, stomach problems, diarrhea, and so on. And we're talking something like 3 jumbo jets a day across India. About half of that is in the Ganges Valley, are dying of these kind of diseases that are preventable, unnecessary, and simply the product of poor hygiene. So it's a story of a river. It's a story of how India can learn the lessons from other rivers and what's been done to other rivers. And indeed, you know, India can teach others its own lessons, because every river is different. And we've heard, actually, interestingly, and you've been on some of these sessions, right? We've heard a lot about, there have been quite a few sessions where the issue of fresh water and rivers and environmental problems have been discussed at this JLF, at this Jaipur Lit Fest. In fact, there was a very interesting session on step wells, which are these ancient wells through which people collected fresh water, and how they've been, in many cases, abandoned, and people are trying to revive them. But there were many other threads of discussion about Swachh Bharat, which is the Clean India campaign, and I was really pleased to see that all these things are being discussed, and indeed it's very topical. So in a way, yeah, this is I was going to say the story of India, but it's clearly not. No one can tell the story of India. It's too massive. It is a story of India, and its many triumphs and disasters. And I say that, as Churchill said of the Thames and of Britain, the Ganges is the golden thread of Indian history. Thank you very much. I'm just going to, I think we've got time for, I'm just going to run through very quickly some pictures just to give you an idea of the river. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to give you a sort of visual idea of what we're talking about. Just run through the slides, and then I think we're going to sit down and have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So if we can go for the next slide. So this is the source. This is Gomukh. In the distance, you see the glacier under that Himalayan peak. This is where the Ganges emerges from the foot of a glacier, and Gomukh means the mouth of the cow. And indeed, obviously, I went there in 2013, and when you look at the glacier, it does indeed look like the mouth of a cow. And the source, or the water, comes out of there in a fast-flowing stream and heads off down the river. And this is Bujbas, which is where there's a couple of ashrams about 5 kilometers downstream from Gomukh. Next one, please. Oh, sorry, that's just me at the source. You don't want to see that. Next. This is Swami Sunderland, who's one of the holy men who is in Gangotri, which is a little. We're going to progress slowly downstream. He's at Gangotri, which is, it's about 25 kilometers from the source. The holy town of Gangotri. And this is one of the holy men who lives there. There are lots of ashrams, there are lots of sadhus, and he was telling me a lot about the problems of climate change, and also the problems of overexploitation of the river for tourism and so on. Next. And this is one of the ceremonies that takes place every day at the temple in Gangotri, and the temple is the goddess Ganga's temple. And in the winter, she's moved a little bit downstream to Hasil, but this is in Gangotri itself. Next. And this is a map, just to give you an idea. I don't know how big it is on that screen, but you can see, so on the left, you've got the source of the river, which is, there are 3 main source streams at the top, and they all meet up, and then the Ganga proceeds across North India and ends up in the delta is mostly in Bangladesh, but also on the Indian side of what is now an international border. Next. This is Devprayag, which is where the Alaknanda meets the Bhagirathi, and then becomes the Ganga as she flows downstream. These were the great floods of, again, not many people outside India will remember this, but in 2013, about 6,000 people were killed when there was a massive flash flood event at the sources of the Ganges, and many pilgrims were washed away and killed in this very tragic event. This is actually at Rishikesh, so that's Shiva, statue of Shiva at Rishikesh that was subsequently knocked over because the river completely overflowed its banks, and that statue was wiped out. But more importantly, there were many people killed, and a lot of people blamed global warming and climate change for that event. Essentially, what would normally have been snow was in fact very heavy rainfall, and that led to the very sudden rush of water that killed all the people. Next. This is still at Rishikesh. This is Parmat Niketan. This is one of the ashrams where again they have an evening ceremony every day at the river bank. So I'm standing with my back to the river when I took this picture. Next. Now we're just north of Haridwar. This is just a peaceful scene on the river. After an extreme slope from Gomukh to Haridwar, the river then proceeds, then the slope between Haridwar and about 2,000 kilometers away to the mouth is very, very shallow, which is one of the reasons why the Ganges slides around across the countryside in a very unpredictable way and can move as, several kilometers one way or the other, depending on the season, depending on the monsoon rains and so on, because there isn't much of a slope to guide the river. Next. These are the Naga Saudis. Again, Indians will be familiar with this, but these are the naked ascetic holy men who get to go first at the Kumbh Mela to bathe in the confluence of the river. And this was 2013. Next. This is Hastinapur. It just gives you an idea of the kind of garbage that tends to litter the river all along its banks. It's a little bit depressing. There is a lot of plastic and garbage in the river, as there are in other rivers around the world. This is Chunar Fort, so we're slowly heading downstream. We're getting near to Varanasi now. This is a place where the river curves northwards and heads towards Varanasi. The river's pretty big at this point, certainly in the wet season. And I saw some freshwater dolphins right here on the left of that picture, which always cheers me up when you see dolphins, because it makes you realize that the water is, even if it's polluted, it's still livable for dolphins. That's Varanasi, which those of you who are Indian again would like to be very familiar with. Varanasi at dawn, an astounding place to visit. Of course, we're in Rajasthan, and you should all visit Rajasthan, but I'm always depressed by how many tourists only go to Rajasthan and Delhi and Agra, and they never go to Varanasi or Calcutta or other parts of India that are also magnificent. Next. This is the temple of the boatman in Varanasi. Where the boatman who took the god Ram across the river. Oh, this is this poster is probably more raunchy than would be allowed in today's India, but this is actually a poster from 1985, and it's a very famous film with fantastic music, actually, by the way. And the woman you see there is Mandakini, but that is the actress. But she is Ganga. She is the personification of the goddess Ganga. And the film is a kind of allegory or metaphor. I mean, she's abused by various nasty types, unpleasant holy men, corrupt officials, people who try to rape her, they enslave her as a dancer, and so on, as she tries to go and meet her loved one. And there's a parallel story, which is the bad guys are not just misbehaving with her, they are also trying to pollute the actual river with a factory that is going to pollute the Ganga. So there's a kind of parallel story. And this was around the time when a previous Indian government Rajiv Gandhi's government was launching one of the first campaigns to clean up the river. Next. That's a slightly more modest picture of Ganga. That's from Narora Barrage. Next. Now there's a couple here. These are the old budgerows that were used, essentially Bengali riverboats that were used for most traffic up and down the Ganga until the age of motor. And sadly, I don't think I've ever seen a sailing boat on the Ganga itself. And that is a big change from even 20 or 30 years ago. Next. That's Modi. I mentioned the walls of the Red Fort, where he talked about sanitation and so on, and that's him in 2014. Next. That's the Yamuna, rather disgusting, I'm afraid. That's another rather disgusting. This is a very typical scene. You'll see this outside any number of Indian towns on the Ganges and on its tributaries. Now we're sort of in the middle of North India now. This is Bundelkhand, an area where there's a terrible shortage of water every year, in fact. And this village of about 3,000 people has only one well that works. All the traditional, those metal hand pumps that you see across India, they all produce, in this area, they all produce salty, undrinkable water. I know because I tasted it. And there's one well, which I think is the next picture, which is a 300-year-old well which produces fresh water. And the whole village is entirely dependent on this well. And in villages around here, people have essentially migrated because There's no water for the fields, there's no water to drink. And they've ended up in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Delhi, essentially because there is no life on the land except during the monsoon season. This was just to show the dependence of Delhi on water that comes from the Ganga and other rivers several hundred kilometers to the north. There was a political protest in Haryana. They broke the canal that brings most of the water to Delhi, and with temperatures around 48 degrees centigrade in the shade, a sort of metropolis of something like 25 million people was left without any water, and it could have been a very grave crisis. And the Indian government, the only time I think when I lived in India that the Indian government actually sent troops in to secure a civilian piece of infrastructure, and that was this. Yeah, that's fine. It's okay, you can go next. This is a gharial, one of the rare Gangetic crocodiles. The painter of this, by the way, is a guy called Sitaram, who is an Indian painter who worked for the East India Company and recorded a journey up the river. And that's an actual gharial on the Chambal River, which is another tributary of the Ganga, which goes into the Yamuna. And now we're almost at the end now. This is the Hooghly River, just to sort of show that this is a navigable river with a lot of, obviously a lot of trade and so on, although not nearly as much as the government would like. Next, and this is just a misty day on the Hooghly. Again, there are lots of dolphins here. No gharials. There used to be gharials here, but no longer. Now we're in Calcutta, getting quite close to the mouth of the river. This is Ganga Sagar, which is right where it's an island where the Ganga meets the sea. And every year there is a festival related to the myth, the sort of founding myth of the Ganges. Essentially, there was well, it's a bit long to explain actually, but there's a shrine to a holy man called Kapil Muni who killed the 60,000 sons of Saga, and essentially to bring back his sons or to redeem them and to give them moksha. One of his descendants, who was Bhagirat, hence the name Bhagirati for the river, performed a lot of ascetic meditation, and as a result, the Ganga came down from heaven and watered the whole of India, North India. The festival essentially takes place around the shrine to Kapil Muni. Next. And this is again one of the Naga Saudis who is there at Ganga Sagar, and it's a colourful event. I think I was the only foreigner, something like 1.5 million people, and I didn't see any other foreigners there except for myself. This is all at the mouth of the Ganges. This happens every year. Oh, I like this one because these are traditional Bengali minstrels, and I was with a Bengali-speaking colleague, and I said to her, I love this music, it's very haunting. They play these traditional instruments like an ektara, which is a one-stringed instrument, and they have drums, and they sing these absolutely beautiful songs, often about love and loss. And I said, I couldn't understand the words, so I said, well, what are they singing? And she said, they are singing, please use the toilets and wash your hands afterwards. I said, oh, and it turns out, if you look at they have badges around their necks. They're actually being paid by the government to sing this message of sanitation. But there is actually a sort of a lesson there, which is that these events are incredibly sanitary. They're very well run. There are roads, there are boats. It's all very safe. It all works incredibly well. And the question is why it can't be made to work all year round, not just for the festival. Next. This is Sunderbans, which is the world's biggest mangrove swamp at the mouth of the Ganges, and this is collecting honey from the Sunderbans. These people actually risk, quite a lot of people are killed by tigers, man-eating tigers, when they go into the forest to get honey, to get wood, and so on. Next. This is just one of I rather like this blue crab. This woman is fishing for what's known as prawn seed using a mosquito net. This is it's a slightly unsustainable practice because the problem with this net is that it's not an actual net, it's a mosquito net, and it just picks up everything. So anything that it catches essentially is killed. And now we're getting very close to the end. This is, as we approach the sea, this is the sort of edge of India. This is where the river meets the sea. Next. And that's it. That's the end of the slideshow. Not all of these pictures are in the book, and there are some in the book that are not here. But just to give you a rough idea of how it goes, and I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. That was great for getting a sense of the river from its very beginning in the snowy Himalayan mountains all the way to the sea. And looking at these pictures made me think that the river is not just carrying water, it's actually carrying a lot of silt. And it's that silt that fertilizes the Great Plains of North India. It's that silt that creates the rich fisheries that not only sustain people, but also the gharials that you showed us. So in the book, you talk about one of the biggest threats to the Ganga today in her upper reaches, which is that of dams and projects which end up actually holding back the silt as well as holding back the water in ways which have serious consequences for what happens downstream, but also for these geologically very active areas of the Himalayan region. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And there is a chapter on dams and droughts and so on in the book. I mean, the important thing is that it's not just what we put into rivers that causes the problems, it's also what we take out of the rivers. And I think most of the Indians that I met, Indian experts, whether they were religious people or not, they said it's not just about pollution, which is correct. It's actually that there's just not enough water flowing down the river. And there's something like an 80-kilometer stretch in the dry season where there's no water at all in the Ganga. And this is obviously, it's not just damaging for animal life, it's also damaging for human life. So yes, there is a huge problem of over-extraction of water. And contrary to what people tend to believe, this is not actually mainly for the cities. Only something like, I think 2% of the water is used for industry, maybe 5% for the cities, and the vast majority of the water is for agricultural irrigation. And that's where the water goes and why it's taken out. There is an additional problem of silt, and it's a particular bone of contention, in fact, between India and Bangladesh, because there's a barrage right at the border there, which is designed to keep enough water flowing down the Hooghly River, which is one of the distributaries where the river comes out, to keep sort of river traffic flowing down there. So but it's done a lot of strange things to the silt. And one of the things I think, you know this, to understand about the river is that it's not a river like we know in Europe, where rivers sort of go up and down, but they tend to be pretty much, they look like the same most of the time. The Ganga has something like 100 times as much water during the peak of the monsoon season as it has in the dry season. So you get these massive fluctuations in the quantity of water. So one month you've got this raging torrent, extremely dangerous, sweeping aside villages, moving fields, killing people, really a sort of frightening river to see. And as I said, it changes its course quite substantially, as do many of its tributaries. But then in the dry season, you have really only a small flow of water coming down. And the problem, of course, is that the dry season is precisely when the water is required for irrigation. So then you're sort of redoubling the problem. Climate change adds another issue because the ice is beginning to melt too fast, so we have a potential problem that there will be very little flow at all in the dry season if we carry on like this. So.
I think what you bring out really well in the book is how, in a way, the Indian government wants it all. On the one hand, 91% of the water of the Ganga, as you say, is being withdrawn for agriculture, only some of which returns to the river in one form or the other. But at the same time, this government in particular is really pushing for inland navigation. And the boats that you showed us are, in fact, now about to be replaced by more modern steam and other kinds of boats not steam, sorry, but motorboats,
yes, absolutely,
motorboats on the river. Now, which would mean an extraordinary amount of re-engineering in terms of dredging, in terms of straightening, and so on. So, what do you make of these grand plans, and how do they sit with the desire to keep taking out water for irrigation at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it's incompatible. I would say they're exactly that. They're grand plans. China has a bad habit of executing its grand plans for rivers, including on the Brahmaputra, which is one of the the most important tributary in some ways of the Ganga. But in India, the problem is not so much that they've announced these kind of plans. I don't think these things will ever happen. I don't think. But what I do think will happen and should happen is the grand plans to clean the river. We have Namami Gange. We have this government has made a very big deal about its plans to clean the river. It's put up a $3 billion plan. I forget how many crores of rupees that is, but it's a lot of money to clean and save the river. Modi himself has committed himself to do that. But the reality is that, so the problem is not the grand plans in this case, the problem is the lack of implementation of the grand plans. In fact, I was looking up, there was the Auditor General does a report every now and then on different ministries and so on. They did one on the Ganga plan, and which came out in December. I don't know if you saw that. And of the $1 billion that was supposed to be spent in the 2 years up to the plan, only less than a quarter was actually spent. And worse, of that quarter that was spent, it's pretty clear that a lot of it has been wasted. And the Auditor General's report was extremely critical of the failure to do anything with the money. First of all, the failure to spend the money that was available, and secondly, of the failure to do anything sensible with the money that was actually spent.
Well, in a way, that's not new, because even with the earlier Ganga Action Plan, we know that, and it's been, I think a number of reporters have used this very phrase, it's been watered down, it's been money down the drain. So even with this scheme, we see that, that it's more of the same. Now, in your book, you point out that it's not as if Indians can't pull off extremely complex logistical feats. It's not just the Kumbh Mela or putting a satellite to orbit Mars. It's also conducting major exercises like the national elections, or on a smaller scale, something like the Jaipur Literary Festival, which always to me seems like this immense logistical feat. Why do you think we can't do something about the fact that only 1/10 of the sewage that goes into the Ganga actually gets treated? I mean, that's a disgraceful figure. Why can't we fix that?
It is disgraceful, and it's not just disgraceful, as you pointed out. It's not just this government. I mean, for decades, governments of all persuasions, Congress body governments and now BJP government, there have been plans and plans and plans and plans, and lots of money has been spent and very little has been done, both on sanitation generally and on river cleanups. You had Ganga Action Plan 1, Ganga Action Plan 2, you had Yamuna Action Plan 1, Yamuna Action Plan 2. I think there was even a Yamuna Action Plan 3, and it led one of the NGOs, the environmental NGOs in Delhi, to say, gap 1, gap 2, yap 1, yap 2, it's all just yap, 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 and nothing has happened. And it's true. So this is not unique to this government. And then the question is, why is it that the money is there, apparently the will is there, and nothing has been achieved? And it's not just rivers, of course. I mean, you look at healthcare, you look at education. I mean, these are all massive problems. Environmental issues, in my mind, very important, but they're equally important is the issue of schooling and the sort of failure of the education system. And I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I think you could say that it is to do with systems of government or governance. And when it comes to water issues, one of the biggest problems is to do with the lack of municipal power. So you don't have, in Varanasi, you don't have a really powerful city government that is financed, that has a mandate from the people that says, okay, we're going to clean up this town, and we're going to have sewage treatment plants and no excuses, and that's that. What you have is a central government that says, let's do this, and please all do this right away, and then it passes on the money to the state government, which mostly steals the money. I mean, this is unfortunately the case, especially with sanitation. Or if it does implement something, it doesn't do it very effectively. I mean, Uttar Pradesh is 200 million people. It's a country the size of Brazil. There isn't sort of enough government capacity there to focus on each individual project, which has to be done at the local level. And I think somehow India needs to have local power implementing local projects. You know, Delhi is about the only city that has any kind of overarching city government with any power at all. And even in Delhi, you've got sort of divisions between the municipalities. So it's really an issue of implementation, and the implementation is not happening because of the way the government works, or rather the way the government doesn't work.
Well, one would think that at this moment, when Mr. Modi's party is in power at the center and in the state of Uttar Pradesh, they should be presiding over a coordinated effort to try and clean the Ganga up, because what's there to lose? I mean, cleaning the Ganga would mean praise and acclaim from everybody. So perhaps the problem isn't so much about the lack of what we call political will, but perhaps it's to do with the ways in which all the ordinary people you showed us who, you know, worship the river, actually don't really care about the extent of physical degradation and pollution with which they live. I mean, people seem to be willing to just carry on as they are.
I think, you know, people have priorities, and it's always been the case that in countries that are underdeveloped, that are poor, people are trying to survive. They do not have time to worry about whether there's a plastic bag in the Ganges. They just want to make sure they've got enough rupees to buy dinner or to get water or to go to school. I mean, this is I think the problem. But you pointed to something really important, which is that the thing that I think that one forgets is that people have this idea that cleaning a river is this huge task in itself that involves, I don't know, what do? You clean the river, let's clean the river, let's scrub it. You don't have to scrub anything. All you have to do is stop putting things in the river. The river's natural flow does the rest. And again, you know, every activist along the Ganga will tell you, all we have to do is we don't have to clean the river, we just have to stop dirtying it. And within 5 minutes, actually, at any given point on the river, if you stop polluting it, it's clean, you know, because the clean water is coming from upstream. So we just have to do that. But the other thing you said, I think is really important. This is not controversial. This is the wonderful thing about saving the Ganga. There is no one who says this is a really bad idea. I'm offended. My religion is offended. You know, I mean, Modi himself, he talked a lot about, in the election campaign, a bit less now, but he talked about, you know, Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, which is this kind of Muslim, Hindu, syncretic culture of North India, and using the two rivers as a way of explaining that you can have multiculturalism in the river. And Muslims, of course, for them, the river has always been hugely important. In fact, the Mughal emperors were very obsessed. They believed that the water had extraordinary powers of, you know, basically they had it ferried for hundreds of kilometers by camel to their palaces because they were so convinced that this water was absolutely the best water that was available anywhere. Even the East India Company, when they filled up with water from Calcutta and went back to England, the water didn't rot or didn't start smelling halfway through the voyage, whereas the water that they brought from England in the other direction did. So there's definitely, you know, the great thing is no one is going to complain if you clean the river. And in fact, you know, I don't think it's quite true that poor people don't care. I think they do care, but often the problem is people don't draw the link. So they don't draw the link between lack of sewage treatment, lack of toilet use, and the fact that their child is sick. If they did draw that link, they would be much more enthusiastic, I think, about making the change.
On that question of sickness and disease, I wanted to describe what was quite a revelation to me in the book, which is the way in which the pollution, the fecal contamination of the Ganga's waters is responsible for the creation of these superbugs that are immune to antibiotics, and what that means in terms of a huge looming public health crisis. Will you tell us a bit more about that? Yeah,
there is a chapter called Superbug River. I'm not a scientist. It was actually the only chapter where I said I have to have this vetted by somebody who really knows what they're talking about. But essentially, India it's not caused by the river, but India is a focus, is a hub, if you like, for the development of superbugs, including, and they are transmitted through rivers, through sewage. So when pilgrims come from Delhi and they all go up to Haridwar, they bring with them not only pollution in the form of sewage and disease, they also bring with them genes, bacterial genes, that code the bacteria to resist antibiotics. And antibiotic resistance is a huge problem globally, and it's a huge problem in India. And India is one of the sources, not the only source, but it is one of the sources of this extremely dangerous, not exactly epidemic, but this extremely dangerous global crisis. You know, people are saying now that by 2050, 10 million people a year could be dying of untreatable diseases because the bacteria with which they are infected cannot be treated by any antibiotics. Already in India, you've got the latest figures, which are from several years ago, show that 58,000 newborns a year, newborns alone in India, are dying of completely untreatable diseases in hospitals. So you have, you know, and you imagine how many there are outside hospitals, and we don't even know if they can be treated or not. It's a huge and growing problem. It is quite complicated. It's important to understand it's not a human gene, it's a bacterial gene, but it's very prevalent in the water. I mean, 2 examples of this were found in Delhi's drinking water by some scientists once. And it was found in a third of the water sort of lying around in the streets of Delhi. So it's definitely a problem, and we should be aware of it. India is the main reason why India is a center for this, and we should probably open it up to questions now, is that it has what a friend of mine called a sort of perfect storm of factors. And they are a lot of disease, very poor sanitation, and a big pharmaceutical industry, and misuse of antibiotics. And those combined essentially help the accelerated evolution of superbugs. That's, in a nutshell, what the problem is.
I wish we had more time, because there's so much in this book that absolutely cries out for discussion. But thank you so much, Victor. We have a little bit of time now for some questions. And if it's all right with you, we'll take maybe 2 or 3 together.
Well, up to you. Yeah.
So we'll take the questions in clusters of 3. Please keep your comments and questions as brief as possible. I see 2 urgent hands, the gentleman in the hat, the one right next to him, and the person at the end. And we'll come on to this side in the next round.
Now, I'm mountaineer. I'm start my journey of mountaineering from the Gomukh Glacier and Tapovan. So, my request to writer, what you found on Gomukh Glacier, bridges and other thing put up by the Kavariyas. Kavariyas put up bridges there on the Gomukh. And we put up the water of the, 1 bottle of the water from the Ganga, from the Gomukh. The Gomukh is the blessed birthplace of the Ganga.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, my question is that, what is your opinion and what you found on Gomukh Glacier, bridges put up by the Kavariyas? And UN also.
Thanks. I think we need to move to the next question. We
just
really have to give
what is your
everybody
message?
a chance.
What is your message for cleaning the Ganga?
Please pass the mic to the next person, because we have a lot of hands.
Yeah, I read a book called Where India Goes, and one of the themes in that book is how, as Victor also mentioned, ritual purity and notions of ritual purity mean that, for example, people don't want toilets in their homes, right? So, does that message, do you think, need to go more broadly from the government on how caste hegemony, for example, needs to be removed, and how ritual purity needs to be reversed, and how that could help improve healthcare?
Okay, caste and ritual purity, and whether that can work in some sort of public health message. Next.
I don't have a question, but since my village is next to Ganges near Garmukteshwar, I want to say 2 points. Apart from saying that my head hangs in shame, because when living beings are dying and books are being written, so it's very important. One is, when the life gets tough, the tough get going. So 4 days from today, 1 new army battalion is going to be raised in Allahabad for the Clean Ganga mission. This is the first one of the 4 which is going to be raised, and that will be addressing your questions of the gaps and implementation. So that is 1 point. Second is, I heard that great song, Ganga, Why Do You Flow? Ganga Tu Behti Hai Kyun by Dr. Bhupen Hazarika. He gave us this warning in 1960s, and it came from his experiences during his PhD at Columbia while listening to the Old Man River and singing along with that great guy who used to sing that song. Thank you.
That's the Paul Robson song. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try and answer them all fairly briefly. Starting at the beginning, I mean, Gomukh, indeed, I mean, I and anyone who goes to Gomukh collects water. Obviously, in my case, I'm not a Hindu. It wasn't for myself, but I took some to my friends in Delhi, and they were delighted because obviously the water from the source is considered to be more pure and indeed more holy than any other, and if not the source, then from Gangotri. So I of course, took it all the way back to Delhi with me and gave it to my friends. And actually, one of the interesting things about Ganga water generally is that it contains a lot of silt. And if you, when the bottle settles, you see a lot of sand or silica at the bottom. The second question, I think the way to answer this about government messages and so on is I think in one of your panels, the emphasis was put on the need for all of us to take responsibility. Of course, the government has to do certain things like build sewage treatment plants, but we all need to just change our behavior in every way possible. We all talk about it and we very rarely do it. I mean, I live in Hong Kong, and the amount of packaging that we all kind of use is just completely insane. And we try to stop it, but it's very, very difficult. Every apple comes with a little plastic sticker on it. It's wrapped in this kind of foam stuff if it's imported from China, and it's just horrible. But anything that we can each do to change our behavior is obviously sensible, and it probably isn't that difficult, but it just requires a little bit of effort and a little bit of change. I was told that the other day that 5 million plastic water bottles a day in Hong Kong are thrown away. I mean, it's just terrifying.
Maybe then we can actually start with a small step here, which is to ask the organizers of the Jaipur Literary Festival to hand out water bottles to everybody. And have water dispensers where we can refill our water bottles. It's a small step, but all of this completely unnecessary plastic can be eliminated.
There are some events, yeah. There are some events that have done this, and there are some clubs that have done this, and there are and there are some hotels that do this. I've been to hotels in India where they will not give you plastic water bottles, and they will give you filtered water. Those of you who don't live in India, water is almost always safe, even if it's coming in a glass, because everybody drinks filtered water, and the water is filtered in multiple ways. So in my house in Delhi, I had a pre-filter, post-filter, a triple filter that had UV and reverse osmosis and so on. So in a restaurant, typically, if you get a glass of water, it's highly purified at the site, and everybody in India drinks this, and it's completely fine. But yes, it's just about changing our ways and so on. Yeah.
Can we take more questions?
Yes, of course. Let's take some more. Yeah.
One question here, the lady in front, and then the gentleman waving his hand.
All right, sir, right here. So I run experiential trips with foreign nationals. Is it working? It's okay. I run experiential trips with foreign nationals. Have been to Hooghly, Allahabad, and Varanasi. It's so unfortunate that the boatmen, they spit all the time, the dry tobacco, and while we are explaining to the guest, and is the basic sanitation practice is one issue, which I am sure you might have observed in your interpretation. Also, there is this new deforestation happening near Uttarakhand, Gangotri, on the name of whitening the roads. Then they say that Namami Ganga and sanitation projects. Do you believe that India can come up with all this crisis and can actually save Ganga for real? Thank you.
Yep, up here in front.
Hello, thank you very much. Just a quick question to see if you think the example of New Zealand, who's giving legal status to some of its rivers, identifying them as legal persons, would maybe be a solution.
Can I just answer that right away? Because an Indian court indeed did that in UP somewhere? Uttarakhand, yeah. So there was actually an Indian court that declared the river to be a holy being, a living entity, that's right. And but to me, the problem is not laws or declarations, particularly in India. That's not the issue. The issue is implementing the law. it's easy to declare any number of things. I mean, governments, as we said, successive governments have done things.
In fact, to add a postscript to that, the court did say that the river should be treated as a living entity, but the Uttarakhand government came right back and said, oh no, we can't allow that because then we can't build dams.
I think they appealed and they won,
That's right.
I believe. Yes, so it was then undeclared as a living entity. So,
Yeah.
right.
Should we take one more question? Sure. Yes.
As a visitor to India, I'm certainly not an expert on the Ganga. However, I do know something about the implementation of major public interest projects around the world. Every such project, if it's going to be successful, needs good planning, it needs effective strategy development, it needs support, public political support, it needs money, but above all, it needs an effective, responsible, directly responsible implementation agency. This project I find really interesting. You've got public support at the highest level, which we've already heard about. The money is available. My question is, who is directly responsible? It's all very well to talk about the various things we can do. And there are lots and lots of those, but they will, in my view, will never be done until there is a directly responsible body. My suspicion is that this is lost somewhere in some ministry or a series of ministries. My suggestion from abroad is that whoever that is needs to set up a state responsible body that clean the Ganga body. They are responsible. They will spend their time developing the solutions and the strategy.
Right. We're out of time, so Victor, you'll have to respond to this and we'll call it.
And I'm happy to answer questions outside. I think I'm going to be signing books out there, so you're more than welcome to come and talk to me afterwards. I'll be around there and indeed all afternoon. Just to come to the last question first, it's almost like you read a sentence that I wrote in the book saying exactly those things. You know, you need to get data on the problem, you then need to plan, you then need to have a strategy, you need the political will and so on. And you're absolutely right, the key issue, and I say this somewhere in the book, is about accountability. One of the problems in India is that officials are moved around. Senior officials responsible for different things are routinely moved from one year to the next. And this is from the Indian civil service. And this is a huge problem because somebody will do something and no one is being held accountable. The state government isn't being held accountable. That official is not held accountable. So what will typically happen is a sewage plant will be built, it will run more or less okay for a year or two, and then it will just be forgotten about, the money will be stolen, and then it falls into disuse. And this is just a huge problem, and it is about accountability. And somehow, yes, India needs to get that done. Have we really run out of time? Yes. So I just want to end then with the very, to go back to a question that somebody asked, which was, you know, can this work? Can the river be saved? And the answer is absolutely yes. You know, it's very important to understand the Ganga is not dead. This is a living river. I've bathed in it myself, and I'm still here. You know, it's not that bad. But it could become bad if you look. You know, if you look at the Yamuna below Delhi, if you look at the Ramganga below Moradabad, you know, these are terrible, toxic sort of drains. You know. And we don't want the Ganga to become like that. And in order for that not to happen, we have to do all the things we've discussed, which is essentially, it's not difficult, it does involve money, it does involve a little political will, and it involves people being held accountable. But, you know, there is much more than hope. There's a real possibility that we can turn this around, and that the present government will begin to achieve some of the things it says it has set out to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for writing this wonderful book, and thank you for being here today. Thank you all.
We wish to thank Victor Mallett and Amita Baviskar for this enlightening session. The author will be available to sign their books at the book signing area. He's also available to have a further interaction